What is going on, guys? It is Venom Surge here, and welcome back to another episode of Elder Scrolls Online. Today we are not actually going over a set, we are talking about the issues that Update 35 is bringing. Make sure to stick around for the end of this video. I'm going through multiple ideas that could help save this update, but the last idea I have I think is probably the best option, but it is also going to require the most work from ZOS. Now, I know there's a lot of videos out there and you probably heard the news. If you somehow haven't, they're basically taking all the DOTs and anything currently that will stick onto you or stick on to the enemy is going to be doubled in duration and halved in the DPS. It'll be going every 2 seconds. They did make it so that way the overall damage done, or healing, this also affects healing, done is more per cast but less per second. So this is an attempt to bring the power gaps together and do all that. This episode, I wasn't sure if I was going to do this, but I think it's good to get more opinions out there, and I have some ideas that I've heard from different places that might help to push Update 35 into a better direction. So there is one thing, this isn't to do with Update 35, but I've seen some people talk about this, and that is with not finishing the hybridization of your characters. The potions and jewelry are still separated, and the issue with that is we have class passives, specifically like the Templar has a minor spell damage passive that affects your whole group. So even if you're stam focused, it would be better to swap your jewelry to spell damage to get that higher. Potions are the same thing. What if I already have all the buffs I need as far as one side, but I need it on the other? Because that might be boosting better. So those types of things are not hybridized, and it affects more endgame people. It's not going to be affecting as much on the lower end, but still it's part of the game that should be fixed. Now I'm going to start out with the nerf to light and heavy attacks. They made the overall damage a flat rate, and they made it so low that if you are a newer person who has an okay setup, you can get the same level of light attack and heavy attack. So anybody who's like mid game and actually has a setup, you may not even be end game, you may not know how to do a good rotation, but even your light attacks and heavy attacks would probably be nerfed. This is to try to bring the top end down, and technically it did, but it brought everybody down. And this kind of forces the high end now to also use specific gear, and so it's kind of making a gear power gap. So now, if it's not based on your stats, if you want to increase your light attack, you need to have the certain gear, such as the Maelstrom Staff. Increases your light attack damage. New players aren't going to have that. So now you've created a power gap as far as gear is concerned. Same with skills that would provide the empower buff, or sets that do as well. I would have raised it up so that way people who are in the mid game about their light attack damage, that way it's still nerfing the high end and buffing the low end. And then most of all, I'm not entirely sure how people would think about this, but change the buff of empowerment and the Maelstrom Staffs. Now, you might want to keep that same gear gap because it is a great set, but there is something that we've been lacking for a long time, and that's recovery. Recovery is almost not really a worry anymore. They reduce the cost of so many things. Now they're increasing the duration by 2 times, so you're not going to be using as expensive skills as often. If we take specifically the level 3 and 4 skills, when they get to those levels, some reduce their cost. If we increase the cost of the more leveled skills, it'll put more focus on us having to rely on regen sets. By putting more emphasis on regeneration, the higher end DPS actually use skills more often than newer players, because they have tighter rotations. They can set off more skills quickly. It may be by half a second, but it's still more often. So if you make those costs higher, they're going to have to sacrifice their own DPS to sustain. My Stam Necromancer used to need a infused Stam recovery glyph because I couldn't sustain. Now they've made so many reductions to costs and increased recoveries for Necros that I was able to swap that out for an infused weapon damage glyph. People used to rely on sets like False Gods where you can gain more recoveries because it was needed, but now that everything's cheap enough, we can have full DPS setups on our gear and not worry about the sustain. Now, because newer players, specifically low-level players, have the baby buff, their recoveries are much higher. So they wouldn't be as affected as much. And on top of that, I think they should only increase the cost of the level 3 and 4 skills. If it's the beginning level skills, they're already expensive. And that's what newer players have to deal with, so leave that. It should be a little bit more expensive on the leveled up version of the skills, and maybe reduce the passives so we don't have as much sustain. I think that would really put the endgame people down a notch as far as their top DPS. Now, because everything is increased if it's a sticky DOT or HOT, sticky's the term they're using. It's like the lightning body armor that the Sork has. That sticks to you, but it does damage in an AoE. That's still every 2 seconds. So if you want good DPS now, you need to have DOTs that go on the ground. So AoE DOTs that are ground based. Which first of all means if you're in a moving fight, you're screwed because you have to reapply everything. But by focusing on those DPS skills, since they're still every second and have higher tooltips, it's going to end up focusing people who want those good DPS to use very specific skills, because originally you would still have options. Like you could use rending slashes on the dual wield line. That's not the best DOT, but it was still a great DOT and it's up there. Whereas now it's going to be weak compared to these AoE DOTs that are ground based. And now that also means we're limited on what weapons would have good DPS. The staves and the bows are the only weapons that have ground-based DOTs that are not affected. That's the main difference. With the two-hander, Stampede, when you stampede at somebody, it leaves a ground-based area of effect that's a DOT. The issue with that is they still made it extremely nerfed because it's not about the damage, it's supposed to be the gap closer. That's its main utilization. The DOT is just a small side effect, so they nerfed those types of things. Same with the teleport strike on the Nightblade. Now, all this nerfs did do about 10k DPS, but it also nerfed everybody else. So there's a lot of people who were frustrated with how ESO is going right now. They're coming back to the game and now they're at a worse stage than they were. Not to also mention they're probably not as practiced as they used to be. Now, one recommendation I saw for this is to make a third tier of morphs, where you would choose to purposely lessen your DPS but extend the duration and overall damage done per cast. And then you can keep the regular skills how they were for people who want to have that higher DPS. This would allow the newer players to choose those longer durations so they can get used to the game and not have to deal with as much right away. And then as they get used to the game, they can swap their morphs over to the shorter duration things and basically work on their rotation. That's what I did with my Stamina Necromancer. That was my main character on Xbox. I used to use Endless Hail because my rotation wasn't perfectly 10 seconds. I was slightly over and I wasn't getting back to my Arrow Barrage as quickly. I was losing out on my back bar enchant. So Endless Hail actually made higher DPS for me, not because the skill does more DPS, but because it kept my enchant up. But once I got tighter rotation and practiced a lot more, I swapped to Barrage because now I can handle that full 10-second rotation. This is the main thing I want to get at. This is something I think that will truly fix where the game is going. However, it is definitely not the easiest to accomplish. Currently, their trouble is that the end game and the beginning is so far apart that making content is very difficult. We've power crept so much that now we can solo stuff in Kraglorn that was supposed to be group content. You originally were supposed to go into the delves with 4 people. You weren't even allowed to enter the delves unless you had 4 people. Now, as long as you're properly set up and know what you're doing, you can easily solo that stuff. So whenever they come up with a new DLC, they have a choice to make. Are they going to make it so that way the mid to end game players are going to actually have a challenge and have fun, so it's at their power level? That means the newer players who hear about this new DLC that ESO made, they come to try it out and everything's wrecking them. There's no balance. They could also make it super easy for the newer players, but then all the end and mid game players are going to be bored out of their minds. So I saw this on a website. They were recommending that what if Elder Scrolls Online made a warrior server? That's just what I'm going to call it, just so we don't get mixed up with the names veteran. If they made a warrior server where everything is harder, it's more health, just like in the vet dungeons, everywhere in the game, including overworld, campaign, whatever. It would be more fun for more experienced players. Instead of making these DLC dungeons that are so hard, like when you look at Imperial City Prison, that was our first DLC dungeon. It's not as easy as Fungal Grotto, but it does scale in line as far as your power. But then you jump up to like Bloodroot Forge. I mean, doing that on vet's a nightmare, but don't even get me started about Frostvault, and they actually had to nerf that because it was too hard. They're trying to make these dungeons more fun for the end game, but it's killing everybody else, or they make it easy and it's not fun for the mid to end game. And just as a note, in the background here, this is me soloing veteran Arx Corinium. Now this is not a particularly hard dungeon, but I'm in a full DPS setup. I do not have any sets that are specifically made to heal. It is a full DPS setup that I should have a healer, but just from the power surge skill alone, I was able to completely survive everything here and just nuke my way through all the enemies. So this is the type of thing where like I should be in a group, but our power creep has gone so far that even as a squishy DPS, we're able to do this. Even some stuff in the content's too easy, even for new people. My 8-year-old cousin who just started playing the game, he's on a Sork and he was running around in Deshawn at about level 7-ish. He has no gear sets, he has no food and no potions. The only advice he received was just to make sure that his dots stay up, and then he just uses his spammable. That was it. He went around soloing some of the world bosses. He didn't know what he was doing. It was a fresh game for him, and we have so much power creep that even with no setup, no CP, nothing, he was able to do world bosses. That's supposed to be group content. So if he can do that with practically no setup, how are more equipped people going to enjoy fighting the easy content that they need to do for sky shards and quests? Because that's the thing, even veteran players, people who are in the end game, they still need to go around overworld and farm their resources, their sky shards, their gear to set up their characters. So if they made a warrior server where everything is hard, it would be much more balanced. The initial level 2 dungeons like Fungal Grotto 2, that was supposed to be the first like vet content, but that was also too easy for mid to end game players, so they made veteran versions of all the dungeons. By adding the warrior server, a vet version of those dungeons would be even harder. So imagine like trying to do Fungal Grotto as a level 10 player, because that's when you unlock dungeons, on a difficulty that is similar to veteran, and that's the normal version of the dungeon on the warrior server. They could balance the difficulty of the dungeons and overland content so that way newer players have content they can do that's not too easy and not too hard, and then veteran players can have content that's actually more difficult and challenging them. There are quite a few endgame players who have over 100,000 DPS. They can skip mechanics just because they're killing the bosses so fast. So if they made a warrior server where everything's harder, they won't be able to skip the mechanics because the boss's health and armor would be much higher. And that's the other thing that could be different about the warrior server. In normal veteran dungeons, they just increase the health. They might increase the armor, but there's still that armor cap. So once you get all the debuffs on the enemies, they're basically naked. So what if on the warrior server, they increase the armor cap on enemies? So that means the end game and mid game have more to work through. Currently, you can just have one tank basically negate all the armor, and that's not even using all the armor negating and reducing sets. So if it had a higher cap, then you would need to rely on more people using those other armor sets to reduce the armor even further. Or maybe the enemies actually have crit resist. If different enemies have different levels of crit resist, that would mean that the normal default setup that everybody knows, like if you're doing PvE, if you want good DPS, what's the one thing you focus on? Getting as much crit and crit damage as possible. If they had not high levels, not as high as PvP, but if they had some levels of crit resist, it would open up more types of builds that could be viable. Now, originally I thought, what if the enemies can crit? This was actually something that ZOS had thought about when they created ESO. A lot of MMOs have problems with their enemies when they crit because sometimes the algorithm of the game will actually end up not glitching, but it might end up making the crits like godly and will completely destroy your entire group instantly type thing. So ZOS decided to just not let their enemies crit. Now another thing that could be interesting as well is what if on the warrior server, this would be a big server drain, so maybe it's not on a countdown, maybe it's just constant, but what if the enemies had health regeneration? As you're fighting them, they're slowly regenerating their health, so if you try to put a dot on somebody and leave, you can't expect them to be dead, they're regenerating their health. So guys, those were my ideas. It's not necessarily a long video, but at this point, I think it's just important to make sure people are speaking their voices and their ideas and make sure ZOS hears what we're all saying. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Normally I do builds trying out every single set in the game and attempting to make some unique and fun to play character out of them. So subscribe if you want to see more of that type of stuff. Like this video so that way we can try to spread it around more and get people's thoughts and opinions on what we should do with update 35. And I'd love to hear your opinion down in the comments and start some conversations about more in-depth ideas that ZOS can do. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys next time.